talks and poems. So, yeah, I wrote something. Kafka's letter to his father ends with Kafka expressing to his father a hope that the text he's writing, the letter, quote, might reassure us both a little and make our living and our dying easier. This document, which never reached its recipient, is, as Deleuze and Guattari note, and as I've tried to argue in my recent introduction to a new edition of it, this document is effectively Kafka's great literary manifesto, the work in which he lays out the axes, stakes, and ground plan of his overall artistic strategy. What's perhaps most interesting to us about its finale here, in this evening's context, is that it binds the practice of living to that of dying and to that of writing. This feat of writing, Kafka claims, will make our living and our dying easier. The union of these three terms is not necessarily frictionless. Indeed, it may be riven with contradictions, but they're bound together, an inexorable triangle governed by the temporality of the ongoing present, living, dying, writing. Ingeborg Bachmann starts her landmark novel Malina by sketching a similar fraught triangle and an anxiety about naming life in the present tense. Writing today, she writes, sends me flying into an anxious haste. Pronouncing the word, my breathing grows irregular and my heart beats a syncopation which can now be captured on an electrocardiogram, i.e. an automated writing machine. Although the graphs, she continues, although the graphs do not show that the cause is precisely my today, always urgent and new, however, I can prove this diagnosis is correct. To use the confusing language of medicine, the disorder precedes acute phobia. It renders me susceptible. It stigmatizes me. Anything written about today, she continues, still quoting Bachmann, should be destroyed immediately, just like all real letters are crumpled up or torn up, unfinished and unmailed, all because they were written but cannot arrive today. That's the end of the Bachmann quote. There is perhaps a knowing nod to Kafka in her image of the undelivered letters, but most striking is the conclusion she reaches, that the only person who should be allowed to speak or write the term today is the suicide. It's an extraordinary formulation, the only position from which one can truly write about living in the present tense, as present and as presence, is the precise moment one is no longer in a position to do so. In other words, to borrow Maurice Blanchot's phrasing, at the instant of one's death. For those of you who've read this last short text, L'instant de ma mort, the instant of my death, in which Blanchot describes facing a Nazi firing squad and feeling, as the soldiers ranged their guns at him, a transcendent sense of exhilaration, which was immediately stolen from him once the soldiers changed their minds and let him go. He'd live and write for another 70 years with, as he puts it, the instant of my death, henceforth always in abeyance. L'instant de ma mort, désormais toujours en instance. Those of you who read it will also know that, just like Kafka's letter, it anchors Blanchot's whole body of thought, which turns always around the central morbidity gives us the right to is not self-expression or freedom, but death. Yet even within the category field of death, Blanchot draws a clear distinction between death itself, la mort, and dying, le mourir, dying. While the first, la mort, death, would be something that can be commanded and named and transformed through art into, for example, tragedy. The second, le mourir, dying, is a movement of absenting, a neutral drifting that can never be possessed or represented. The second is, in fact, the virtual opposite of the first. Dying, he writes, is the immanence wherein life lasts desiring. For him, it's always to this second, ungovernable and inexhaustible slope that real writing must attend, which means that writing will always undo itself as well, that oeuvre will be désœuvrement, unraveling. To want to write, he writes, in Anne Smock's brilliant translation of The Writing of the Disaster, to want to write, what an absurdity. Writing is the decay of the will, just as it is the loss of power and the fall of the regular fall of the beat, the disaster again. So in this short and necessarily telegraphic talk, as you'll see, I'm trying to sketch a set of relations between an incomplete and largely dysfunctional, perhaps even absurd, operation called writing, a space, almost incomplete, also incomplete, or at least indeterminate, of death, and a third practice that emerges from the overlap, always imperfectly aligned, of these last two. A practice perhaps better described not by the term living, but rather by the cluster of expressions that hover around the term undead. Is it a coincidence that Bram Stoker's Dracula takes the form, again, of letters? That what its heroine, Mina Harker, actually does throughout the novel is transcribe and copy records? That Van Helsing, the Doctor's all-important dictaphone, the modern writing machine through which information might be buried, then brought back to life, is set up as an exact analogue to that other black box, the vampire's coffin? Doesn't Richardson's Clarissa, like Dracula, an epistolary novel, also end with characters studying a coffin filled with ciphers, a crypt in all senses of the word, encrypted space? Who is the headline speaker/writer of Faulkner's As I Lay Dying? Note once more the present participle. Who is the I of that book's title? It's, for those of you who've read it, you know this, it's Addie, is the one in the coffin. When, in a stunning central episode, Addie writes to us directly, an impossibility of course, it's to confirm, as she puts it, that words are no good, that words don't ever fit even what they are trying to say at. The word love, she says, is just a shape to fill a lack. Heaven and salvation are just words too. Addie is no Lazarus, come back with sacred revelations from beyond the grave. Rather, she's an undead avatar of literature itself, which begins, as Blanchot neatly puts it, at the very moment when language becomes a problem. So I'll end by quoting from another letter, an 1885 one from Mallarmé to Verlaine. How should the writer capture contemporary life, asks Mallarmé, and immediately answers, he shouldn't. In the final analysis, he writes, in the final analysis, I consider the contemporary era to be a kind of interregnum for the poet, who has nothing to do with it. It is too fallen or too full of preparatory effervescence for him to do anything but keep working with mystery, so that later, or never, and from time to time sending the living his calling card, some stanza or sonnet, so as not to be stoned by them if they knew he suspected that they didn't exist. An even more extraordinary formulation. In it, living becomes a collective noun, designating a group of people, the living, the public, a group that does not include the writer. It's to them, like Kafka scribbling to his father, that the writer sends his calling card, the work, which in turn prevents them from stoning him, making him dead not once but twice, for having stumbled across the secret of their non-existence. The roles are suddenly reversed. To sample Eliot, he who was living is now dead. We who were living are now dying, but at least with a little patience. For Mallarmé, it's the calling card, writing itself, that keeps catastrophe at bay, stops the whole system from imploding, reinterrs the lethal secret, even as it names its structure. Thus the dictaphone keeps whirring, cardiogram jagging,